I now get to introduce our favorite couple, the honeymooners. Their life is one big honeymoon. And of course, I'm talking about Connie and Andrew. And it's become a tradition that every year around this time, they come and they share with us some history. So take it away, Connie and Andrew.
Well, we're so happy to be back here on this Thanksgiving Eve, sharing a journey to gratitude Andrew will be taking you on a journey. And he's the author of the Mayflower Revelations, this novel that we share the coming together of the Mayflower Pilgrim Separatists and the Pokanoket Wampanoags, who they lived in peace and friendship with for 54 years in Plymouth at the founding of this nation. And we call this the spiritual beginnings of our nation. And it's been lost in revisionist history, has shrouded it in misconception and misunderstanding. And it's so key for the psyche of this nation to understand that it came from the direct connection, the desire to have a direct connection to the divine, which was spoken of earlier, that that true freedom of living according to our conscience. And that's native, and that's what the pilgrims were seeking, and stood up to the King of England and separated from the church, which was a treasonous act. So Andrew's going to take you on a little journey. And first of all, though, we're going to bring a Pokanoket grandmother who's a good friend. We're going to bring her in from a recording we did yesterday to do an opening prayer and song. So you can meet Barbara Mary Kurfis and just settle into your hearts through this native sharing. Hi, Barbara. It's just so great to be with you again this Thanksgiving time, like our ancestors were over 400 years ago. Thank you so much for bringing in an opening prayer and song. And now I'm going to hand you the feather and let you come on.
Taniska Nitomp. Hello, friends. In 1621, my ancestor Asamiquan, the Massasoit, and his brother Quataquina, my ancestor grandfather, met with the pilgrims for the first harvest feast, which is now called Thanksgiving. Also, my ancestor pilgrim Stephen Hopkins was present on that day. So I walk in two worlds. So with the coming together in friendship, let us pray. Great Spirit, bring us our hearts together in love and understanding as we walk to the future in love and friendship and keeping us together in peace. Amen. Now, I would like to sing our song, our thank you song, and I'd like to sing it in our Algonquin language, and then I'll sing it in English. And then I have a little something to say at the end. A chance to get going here. Tabatne uchi akk sa. Tabatne uchi nippy quas wakwas nash. Tabatne uchi may take quas kesa. Katanit tabatni, katanit tabatni, hey, hey, oh. Thank you for the earth and sky. Thank you for the water and the rocks. Thank you for the trees and just for today. Great Spirit, I thank you. Great Spirit, I thank you. Hey, hey, hey. Ah. Tabatni Anawan, thank you, all my relations, for coming together in love and with friendship and in peace. Love and blessings for all of us in this coming time.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Such a treat to have the Pokanoket people represented here and who were there at that first Thanksgiving and now celebrate unity and oneness and love with the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
And she is a member, a descendant of the original Native American group who the Pilgrims met when they landed, or actually it was almost 6 months after they landed that they met their first Indian. And she's descended from that little group of people. And she's also descended from one of the Mayflower passengers who landed, Stephen Hopkins. So she, as she says, she walks in both worlds. She carries the blood, those twin bloodstreams, and that goes for an awful lot of people in this country who share European bloodlines and Native American bloodlines that inform their vision of the world. So what I'm going to do is take us on a little shamanic journey through 4 centuries and over many thousands of ocean miles and into the past, starting on, well, I want to ask the question, what was going on at the time when the entire Pilgrim story started? What was going on in England, where they came from, and what was going on over here in America at that time? Today, they call it Turtle Island. I don't really know what they called this continent, but let's call it Turtle Island. What was going on in Turtle Island? Let's go back into, shall we say, the late 1500s, the 16th century. And let's go back in England at that exact time and look at a group of people where radical permanent change was happening in England. It started in the late reign of Queen Elizabeth I. It started at Cambridge University, which is now a very big deal, and it was in existence even then. And it was triggered by the fact that the Bible, for the first time in history, had been translated into English. And all of a sudden, people were reading their Bibles. People had Bibles. You didn't have to go to church and listen to somebody chanting away in Latin or before that Greek. And you have to have an interpreter. You could read it for yourself, which really changed the way people related to the church in particular. So the Church of England was incredibly, what should we say, decadent. There were these large, fat bishops wearing these lush robes, and they lived in these castles, and the whole thing was very, very, shall we say,
and also all the princes and peoples round about us have either made suit.
Sorry about that, kids.
That's one of our little films we were hoping to show. We had actually made these 3 little films, and we were planning to show them. So maybe we can.
I'm sending them to Scott so he can show.
Maybe Scott can do it. Okay, thanks. The painting behind us here, we stepped aside so that you could actually see the painting, is actually a depiction of the first Thanksgiving, 404 years ago this year. It's actually 403 years ago. At 404 years ago, the Mayflower landed. Roughly 9 to 10 months later, they had built these little houses that you see. They had met with the Native Americans. They'd had their first crop that actually had a successful harvest, and they had a 3-day intercultural celebration. Let's think about this coming together, and I'm going to put the focus on gratitude. Why would they be grateful to come together? in a state of gratitude. Just got to make one little move here. Really helps me. Okay. So let's, I just mentioned what was going on in England. The Bible had been translated into English, and it was triggering a major revolution. The King of England was also the head of the church. He was an absolute monarch. He said off with his head, off came the head. It was literally that kind of situation. You did what you were told, or you paid the price, right? And people started to rebel against that and started to go like, wait a minute. And it was illegal not to go to church. It was illegal to have your own religious prayer meetings in your own home. That was illegal. You could get busted and imprisoned for doing that. It was a time of where these early people, I'm sure you've all heard of the Puritans. So the Puritans were a movement of folks who wanted to purify the church. They didn't want to break away from the church. They wanted to purify it from within. They wanted to stay in the church, but get rid of all the stuff that wasn't in the Bible. Like there's no mention of bishops in the Bible. There's no mention of castles for the bishops. There was no mention of all of that stuff that had just been added on later and was sort of leaching the wealth from the communities, just as had been happening for centuries with the Catholic Church, which they'd broken away from back in the days of Henry VIII. As you can tell, a lot of history here, but I think that the fascinating thing is the Native American story, the American story. It's incredibly nuanced, complex, controversial even. There's a little true, what we say, consensus on the part of historians even. So the various historians of that era 400 years ago, trying to figure it out, 500 years ago, trying to understand. 500 years ago, here come the French. Here comes Jacques Cartier, okay? And the very beginning of what became the French fur trade happened at that point. So this is really important because the French fur trade triggered competition among the native people for control of the fur trade. Typical human behavior. No, it's ours. We're in charge. We met them first. We met the French. They gave us these guns, and you guys better not try to sell your furs to these people. Go find your own market, right? Competition for the market. So there's that. There's a cast of very colorful characters. I could literally go on for days on the subject. I'll ask this question. Who was the single most important individual in early American history out of everyone? And I'll give you a hint. His name began with the letter N, and he lived in present-day Medford, Massachusetts. And I don't expect you to know because it's barely even in the history books. He was the head of an organization called the Massachusetts, or that we call the Massachusetts Federation. He was the head of the Sagamore, the king, as the English called him, the king. They didn't, he was a king. His name was Nanepashemet. And what Nanepashemet did was he had a military alliance or a mutual protection agreement with a group of people up north who were having a conflict over competition for the French fur trade. And that competition erupted into a war called the Tarratines War. Now, hang on. Anybody here heard of the Tarratines War? Google it, you'll find a lot there, but you can go up to historians of New England and say, tell me what you know about the Tarratines War, and they've never heard of it. It is a piece of history that's either been forgotten or lost or suppressed. It's hard to say which. But what happened is that the Tarratines War broke out between the Tarratines. Today, you will have heard of their tribe. Today, we call them the Micmac. They lived mostly on Nova Scotia. It was too cold up north. The growing season was too short to grow the three sisters, the corn, the beans, and squash, that all of the Native Americans in Turtle Island depended on. So what did they do? What was their survival strategy? They became a raider culture. They came down the coast in the fall at harvest time And they returned with corn, beans, squash, and beautiful young ladies. Typical behavior, right? And so that was a known thing. So the people down south were accustomed to that. They knew they had literally made their villages portable. They could pack up their villages and move them in an hour. So, like, I think it was Cartier had pulled up off the shoreline of a village like that and watched the village melt away before his eyes. They couldn't believe it. The reason they did that is these raiders would come down, and they were dangerous. They were violent. You just got the hell out of the way. So those were the Tarratines, today's Micmac. And their strategy was, right, raiding. They depended for their food on people to the south to grow it, and they'd come down and steal it. Now, the war started, and that war meant that the war canoes, the birch bark canoes with these raiders, would start showing up at any time at all once the war began, because Nanapashamet from the Massachusetts Federation sent warriors up north to help his friends. You've probably heard of the Penobscot if you've spent any time in Maine, Penobscot country, who got into big trouble with the Micmac / Tarratines. Tarratines is a Basque word, so there's a lot of depth to the story here. And Connie, what?
No, yes.
Yeah, I talk fast. So it's a big, long story, but cut to the basics. A war erupted up north that the Indians from Massachusetts Bay got involved in by sending warriors up to help their friends, their allies. Big mistake from the historical point of view for them, because this war started basically 1607. In 1614, it erupted to another level. 1614 is the year Captain Jack Smith, remember him, of Pocahontas fame?
Jack?
John. Captain John Smith. Everybody called him Jack. I'm sorry. Captain John Smith shows up to map one of his English bosses wanted to plant a colony. They called it a plantation. They wanted to plant a colony in the Massachusetts Bay Area. So he shows up. Patuxet, behind us in this picture, is a place called Patuxet. It was called Patuxet then. It was the home of the Patuxet tribe. Today it's called Plymouth, Massachusetts. Does that ring a bell? And normally at this time of year, where are we? We're in Plymouth, Massachusetts. We go every year. This is very unusual for us to be here in Colorado. So Smith shows up and he's taking notes. He's doing estimates. He says Patuxet has approximately 2,000 warriors. 2,000 warriors, that means probably 5,000 people. It was a pretty significant community. But little did he know, up to the north, this trouble was brewing because these warriors had ceased to come down in the harvest season, were coming down at any time at all and getting seriously violent with whoever they found. They were looking for Nanapashamet, and they couldn't find him. He was very, very well hidden. They didn't catch him until 2019. What year did the Mayflower arrive? Did I say 2019? 1619. I'm sorry, I'll keep doing that. 1619, Nanapashamet is killed. The Tarratines' war comes to an end. But something horrible has happened in the entire coastal region, all the way from Maine down to Cape Cod. It didn't go further south. It didn't get down to present-day Rhode Island. But all along the coast, a pandemic, literally a pandemic. A pandemic is a global epidemic of disease that started in 1616, ended in 1618, and the war that transmitted this disease from up north, it literally came from French fur traders up north, was carried by these warriors down south, infected the people, and took out as many as 90% of the coastal populations between 1616 and 1619. So that's what's going on this side of the pond. on that side of the pond, all of the stuff's going on. The Mayflower Pilgrims had to actually escape from England. They spent 12 years living in Holland, which was much more liberal and allowed for religious freedom, and eventually decided to leave there. Their kids were literally becoming Dutch, and they really still regarded themselves as Englishmen and were, their fealty to the king. They purchased, it's a long and complex story, but they purchased the Mayflower ship. 102 passengers got on this ship and took 66 days to cross the Atlantic. That's an awfully long time to be sequestered on a ship. It was really hard. They hit a hurricane out in the middle there somewhere. They darn nearly lost it and sank, and it's a miracle they survived, but they survived. And in November of 1620, they pulled into what we would today call Cape Cod, the Cape Cod area, around about Provincetown. Provincetown? Yeah, Cape Cod. So, and then they did some exploration. And when they found this place that they decided to settle, of which there's a painting directly behind me and Connie here, they came ashore and they found on the shore skulls on the waterline. They found unburied skeletons. Something terrible had happened. And remember that the information they had was that there were 2,000 warriors in this place. Now there was nobody. Anybody ever hear of Squanto? Squanto was actually a Patuxet, and he was one of the very few survivors. And the reason for that is he had either gone to England of his own volition, or he'd been captured and taken to Europe. There's controversy about that. But he spoke English, he liked the English, and remember, this is about gratitude. So think about the Indians who survived this incredible pandemic between 1616 and 1618. And just imagine losing 90% of your community. Think about your feelings, think about your emotions, right? It was a very, very difficult time for the Native American survivors. The Mayflower folks made it over intact, but when they landed, they did not meet any Indians. There wasn't a welcoming committee of Indians to say, welcome Englishmen. That happened in the spring, on the spring equinox of 1621. Instead, they came ashore. It was a mini ice age. It was incredibly cold, and the Mayflower could not get within half a mile of the beach because today it's dredged. There's a replica of the Mayflower. It's right there. But if you imagine on this journey coming up to the shore and you get to a certain point, you can't go any further because the water's too shallow. So if you're going to get ashore, you're going to have to walk, you're going to have to wade, you're going to have to carry your stuff. So everybody ended up getting soaking wet. In December of 1620, in the middle of a mini ice age, it was probably 15 to 20 degrees, if you're lucky. And as a result of that, plus scurvy or whatever, fully 50% of the 102 passengers died that first winter. Fast forward to the spring. On the spring equinox, all of a sudden, somebody walks into their little town. They built a little, with all of this, with half of them dying, and they had managed to cut down trees, build these buildings, these pretty little buildings that they're in the painting behind us. There's replicas of them, so we know them really well. And all of a sudden, this Indian wearing nothing but a loincloth, it's March 20, what's this equinox? 21st, walks in and greets them and says, welcome, Englishmen, in English. He turned out to be from Maine. He turned out to have known some English sea captains up there, and he had a little bit of English, not much. So what looked like a scary thing, and the guys, ran for their head, these old blunderbuss muskets, but everything was fine. He became the broker for what happened next. He negotiated with the local tribal chief, and he was the chief or sagamore or sachem of the Pokanoket people. He's known as Massasoit. Now, Massasoit's in fact a title. It's not his name. His name was Osamiquan. Don't have to get that detailed. But they had made it through the spring. half their people had died, including Connie's ancestral
13's grandparents.
yeah, yeah. So imagine the emotional state of the Pilgrims at that moment. They'd landed, they'd lost half their people. The Indians, who were about 42 miles away, they didn't live, nobody lived right there, had just lost 70, 80, 90% of their people. Just imagine the human emotional state that these people were in. Samoset was the man from Maine. He said, I'm going to go and I'm going to come back with another Indian who speaks much better English than I do. And we'll see if we can bring the local chief so we can sit down and have a conference. On the spring equinox, when did they sit down? On that same day?
Yeah.
Then Samoset must have come earlier.
He came earlier.
Samoset came 5 days earlier, okay. And because I was always thinking the 16th. Long story short, there's this little vestigial village that's now the beautiful little town of Plymouth, Massachusetts. It had 9 residences, a little fort that they'd been able to build, and a little meeting house that they used for their church meetings and their cultural conferences. On the spring equinox, all of a sudden, here they come. And it's Massasoit, the chief, with Squanto, the one who speaks English, and an estimated 90, in fact, all of his warriors, whatever he had, and we don't know that, before the epidemic, he was reduced to 90 warriors. And he had enemies over in present-day Providence, Rhode Island, who had 3,000 warriors because the disease didn't get that far. Think about his situation. He was desperate. He was heartbroken. He really needed something. And all of a sudden, this boat and these English people show up. And the English people had just lost half their people. Imagine this coming together where it was done in a friendly manner. They sat down, they spoke.
They kissed.
Yeah, you're that classic English thing of, I take your hand and I kiss your hand and I bow to you. They did something like that, apparently, according to because this was all documented and written down by the English. Long story short, the Massasoit said, you're welcome here, and a relationship began. And that was literally on the spring equinox of 1621, the first Thanksgiving, as we now call it.
That was a mutual protection treaty. They signed the 6-point.
There's six points, and it was mostly, you could call it a mutual protection treaty. If any of yours, and if you get into trouble, we're going to come help you. If we get into trouble, you're going to come help us. And a bunch of very, very simple little things, 6 points. And that little agreement held for 54 years, which is pretty darn interesting. So go from March 21st to sometime, when's harvest time? When's the harvest moon? And sometime in mid to late September, I would guess, is when the first Thanksgiving occurred.
Squantum had taught them how to plant Indian corn because they didn't know Indian corn. They were farmers and knew the land, but didn't know Indian corn, and he had taught them that.
Well, there was a technique that they used where they caught fish in the town brook and put these little fish in a mound, and the fish became the fertilizer for the corn as it grew. And as the corn grew, the beans grew up the corn, and then the squash put out these big leaves and sheltered the mound and prevented it from drying out in the sun. It was
the Three Sisters.
Genius, what's known as the Three Sisters. So that's the story, my friends. Here are these two groups who then came together for what turned out to be 3 days of festivities.
In the fall.
They had a good harvest. That first harvest was a good one. The next one was not, so the whole starving time happened later. But in the fall, probably September into October, somewhere in there, this festivity occurred. Massasoit and his 90 men came, and the Pilgrim folks and the Indians had this festivity together. And that is historic fact. There are a lot of other stories. There are a lot of things that are spread. There are a lot of very unpleasant things. And I would just, if any of you have those beliefs, just have a look at them and think about it. There's stories that and Mayflower descendants are ashamed of what they've been told their ancestors did to the Indians. None of that is true. There was a disease. It was between 4 and 2 years before the Mayflower landed.
Thank you.
I want us to imagine the gratitude of these two groups coming together like that. It was a moment of gratitude. It wasn't called Thanksgiving, but everybody, the Indians had a harvest festival. In England, you have harvest festivals. In Holland, where they just come from, there were major harvest festivals. It's a normal thing for humans to give thanks to God for their abundance. Okay?
Yeah, sweet. So just the gratitude that was there, and just to touch base with that, and to be inspired by this coming together of these cultures in this amazing situation, and just for today, in this time of polarization and differences, to be inspired by the fact that these folks came together, and in fact they were spiritually aligned. The Pilgrims were seeking this ability to relate directly to the divine, and that ultimately that we would have a society based on that. And that's what the native way is. The native way is the direct connection to the divine. And so we call this the spiritual beginnings of this nation. And it's just so important to bring in the native piece of this puzzle, because the whole native way is so important for the future of humanity. And we spend a lot of time bringing that forth, is their connection to the oneness and sacredness of all life. And the Pilgrims were aligned with that, and gratitude for all that is. So we just want to be sure people have access to that inspiration, that time, because inspiration can take us to great heights, higher frequencies. Okay, so it's so key for the psyche of this nation, because when you're ashamed of your beginnings, you're in a lower vibration, a lower frequency. When you're inspired, oh my goodness, we did it once, we can do it again. Yes. And we can get to this high level of connection to the divine, and act from that place. So that's our process. We're in process, and we're doing a great job, and let's just keep at it.
Thank you so much. I want to comment, and I'm also going to read a couple comments. Mark Danisovsky writes, "This is the most detailed, legitimate Thanksgiving story I've ever heard. Beautifully told by Andrew and Connie. The sense of celebration is visceral." And AJ and Thomas write, "This was fascinating. Thank you." And I do appreciate the compassionate part of how the Mayflower people were so emotionally suffering, and the surviving Native Indigenous people were, so also suffering. So, two different cultures coming together in suffering, that really touches my heart. I have downloaded that short video. Does it make sense to still show it?
Well, if there's time, did you see the other one of Winslow and Donahue? I sent you that.
The one that I have, Connie, is what you sent me the link. Peaceful Times in the Plymouth Paradigm. That's the one that I've got ready to show.
Yeah,
Okay,
you can
good.
show that
Yeah,
one.
That'd be good.
Then that's taken, what's being spoken is taken from the diary of the Pilgrim people.
Okay, great. Here we go.
Wonderful.
We have found the Indians very faithful in their covenant of peace with us, very loving and ready to pleasure us. We often go to them, and they come to us. Some of us have been 50 miles by land in the country with them. Not only the greatest king amongst them, called Massasoit, but also all the princes and peoples round about us, have either made suit unto us, or been glad of any occasion to make peace with us, so that 7 of them at once have sent their messengers to us to that end. So that there is now great peace amongst the Indians themselves, which was not formerly, neither would have been but for us. and we for our parts walk as peaceably and safely in the wood as in the highways in England. We entertain them familiarly in our houses, and they as friendly bestowing their venison on us.
As an American Indian, and I look back at these days of our first history, I just think it's a shame that the Plymouth paradigm did not endure. The Plymouth paradigm, as I understand it, was based on the idea of sharing, and everything was inclusive. Indians were not left out. They were part of the process, and they felt free to make themselves part of the process.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you very much. Were you guys able to see that?
No, we did not see the image.
We didn't see Betty Donahue, but that's okay. You heard her message.
She's a Cherokee scholar who wrote a book on the Pilgrims and the Indians, and she really studied the linguistics. That's her focus, and really has a profound understanding. So she's a very positive. There's a lot of anger and a lot of misunderstanding, but she really loves and is like a peace promoter of this relationship.
Well, her book was Bradford's Indian Book. She actually shows the influence of the native people on William Bradford, who wrote of Plymouth Plantation, which is in fact the first literary piece of American literature. So anyway, there's that whole perspective of seeing the collaboration and what we call the first great synthesis between Europeans and the American Indian, and the giving birth to the American mind, spirit, and democracy. It's a big deal.
Thank you both so much. Of course, they've written a wonderful book. We put that link in, and I want to take people to the GoFundMe. Most of you know the story that they had $5,000 stolen from them. And so our goal is to raise 5,000. So many of our Global Peace Tribers have already donated. Thank you, Jerry and Dia, and oh my gosh, I mean, look at all the Global Peace Tribers.
Look how close we are. And I just want to thank everybody.
Yeah, talk about gratitude.
Gratitude and the attitude.
Gratitude to you, Scott, and to all who donated, and to all of this community. We love you so much.
We would be in severely dire straits if it weren't for your generosity and love. The bank is being very, shall we say, non-cooperative
with getting us the money back. So thank you.
Well,
all you are and do and your love for us.
A little bit more to get them over the top to that 5,000 mark. We're really close. And I ought to, the books are actually in the chat that they just put in. Connie and Andrews put it back in again. Thank you very much. We love you so much. And may you enjoy a beautiful Thanksgiving. And thank you for giving us that beautiful incentive. And I'm going to bring up our co-host, Tangela. Tangela, what stands out for you and what you just learned from them?
Thank you so much. That was such a comprehensive story and focused on, just the camaraderie that's really at the roots of this holiday, and I think it's such a beautiful sharing, especially during this time, for us to remember that our nation does come, of course, there have been a lot of tragedies and wars, but, there have been times like the one that we celebrate still today when, we have come together to support one another from different backgrounds, different religions, different places, and really being able to, tell the story in this deep way is so beautiful. So thank you so much, Connie and Andrew, for sharing this beautiful story. I'm looking forward to diving in even further with this whole journey. So thank you so much. Beautiful.
Thank you, Tangela.
Thank you, Connie and Andrew.